Hey, how's it going? So, on today's episode, I'm going to tell a story of a place, of a situation that me and my brothers found ourselves in. It didn't really affect them like it affected me. When I made the decision to tell the story, I talked to Dusty, and he kind of gave me his little piece from his perspective because he was much younger than I was at the time. I think I was like fifth grade. I'm pretty sure I was fifth grade when this occurred. So let me give you. I've been kind of debating on how to break this down. So I was a young kid, and my fifth grade year, I spent part of that time in San Diego, and I spent part of that time in Paramount, California. And then I spent a little bit of that time at my dad's in Bellflower. I know that I ended the school year in Bellflower, so I'm sure that we went from San Diego to LA to Phoenix. So, basically, I don't know how else to say it. We lived in a legitimate, real deal haunted house. When I was a young kid, when we were moving to this house, I remember my mom and Uriah and Dusty were in a U-Haul, and I was in my grandmother's car, and it must have been a long drive to get there because I remember they had made a bed for me in the back, and I remember turning down the street that we were going to move to, and I remember seeing the house for the first time, and we actually had driven past it by accident. My mom, nobody had a cell phone. They were working off of maps. My mom had only either seen it or only been there once or twice. And I remember driving past it and looking at that house and thinking to myself, that house is haunted. And then we go to the end of the street and turn around and come back and pull into the driveway. Now, I know a lot of people are like, yeah, right, whatever, or other people, or, the truth of the matter is, I don't believe that people stick around after death. I am a fully devoted follower of Christ, and I believe that there's only two options when you die. But that's just my personal belief, and everybody is entitled to their belief. We all have free will. So whatever was happening at this house, there's no doubt in my mind it was evil. Like, it was evil. You could feel the evil off of this thing. So to start off with, I guess I want to say that in the beginning, even though I knew the house, I felt like the house was haunted when we drove past it, I kind of was still skeptical. There was a few things that happened in the house before anything really happened to me. And when these things happened, it kind of opened up my mind, opened up the idea that, holy crap, this could be bad. I remember, so the house, let me tell you about the house. My mom had a boyfriend at the time, and his parents owned the house. I don't even know if I should divulge all of it. Well, I guess I have to because it's going to come up later in the story. But that boyfriend is Sky's biological father. And I had a chance to ask him about this later. But I'll get to that. So basically, we get there. My mom ends up moving in her friend Mitzi, and she had a son and a daughter. And the way I remember it was that Mitzi basically was the type of person that had a lot of people around. The way that I understand it is she had a lot of boyfriends, and she had a lot of just people around, and she partied, and so these children were used to having a lot of odd people around. And I don't remember the first incident, but one of the incidents happened right before I got home from school. I was the oldest, and I got home the earliest. And I remember getting home from school, coming in the house, and there's this big hubbub. Everybody's like kind of freaking out, you know, and I asked my mom what happened. Being that I was the oldest, you know, my mom always treated me like, I mean, I don't want to say she treated me like an adult, but she always gave me the respect that a lot of parents don't give children that age. And so I remember her explaining to me that this boy was in his room, in their room, and he was terrified. And he was terrified to the point where he couldn't breathe. And he was pale white, and he was pointing at the closet. And so they walked in and found him like this, and they kept telling me, like, there's nothing there. My mom was telling me that she had reached her hand in the closet, and it was an old house, and it had like 2 closet doors that separated and filled the closet, and then you could push them to one side or the other, or both in the middle. And the way I remember, my mom was saying that she had crawled in one side through the closet and crawled out the other side to show him that there was nothing there. And when she got in there, all the hairs on her neck stood up, and it was like icy cold in there. And so when I got there, the boy was, they were trying to calm him down. He was still hysterical, but he was not as nearly as hysterical as he was earlier before I got home. He was like catatonic, you know, like going into shock hysterical when before I got there, and then he was like starting to calm down. He was crying and, you know, just really upset. And Mitzi was like yelling at this thing and like challenging it to a fight or something. And then everybody kind of calmed down, and the other kids came home, and they didn't want to say nothing to scare the younger kids. And then the next thing that happened, there was a thing that happened that I didn't witness, but I heard about, where my mom and Chris were watching TV, or they were I think Chris was laying on the floor. The story was that he was laying on the floor, that he had his hands behind his back, and they were watching TV, and then it felt like something had sat on his chest and was holding him down, and he was freaking out, and then eventually I guess I let him go. And I had an opportunity to ask Chris about this later, and you know, it was years ago. I mean, it was probably 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago when I seen him. But I don't even know how long ago it was. But he kind of downplayed it, because I remember it differently in my head. But it happened to him, so it's his story to tell. But something definitely happened on that floor in that living room that day, and maybe it was this entity, or maybe it wasn't. I don't know. So the next thing that occurred was my grandmother. So my grandmother came into town, and we had been there at this point, we'd been there for months and months. A lot of stuff happened at this house. And I should probably, kind of give you some history. This was a really nice house. From what I understand, this house was, it had really cool hardwood floors. You know, it was an older house. I mean, it wasn't like super fancy or nothing. It had macadamia nut trees in the back, and it had a detached garage. And what I was always told was that this thing lived in the garage, but it came into the house from time to time. And I remember walking past that garage, because there were 3 or 4 little rental properties behind the house. It was like a real long property, and our house was the front house. This is, LA back in the 80s, and people would drive on, like a carport past the house into the back, and there were 3 or 4 little small apartments in the back, detached. And there was like a little detached laundry room that wasn't being used. It was just storage. And then all these houses behind it. So there were kids that lived in these houses. And so we would walk out the back door and go to these little houses in the back to, play with the kids or whatever. And I remember walking past and just feeling like something was just staring at me, something evil. You can just feel the hair on your neck stand up, I guess. This incident with my grandmother, my grandmother, I spent most of my life, childhood, in church with my grandmother as a young kid. My earliest memories of church are going with my grandmother. And she shows up and she's walking around and she is so my grandmother shows up and she makes the decision that she's going to do something about this. And again, it happened while I was at school. I remember coming home and seeing the evidence and it really affecting me. And the story was that she was walking around the house reading her Bible and out loud. And apparently my mom had these jacks, these brass jacks, and the jacks were bookends, and there was books and the 2 bookends holding books on a shelf, and that one of these jacks came off the shelf and embedded itself or made dents in the wall and then fell to the ground. And my grandmother kind of freaked out, and I came home to this and then heard the story and saw the jack on the ground and saw the holes or the indentation in the drywall. I want to say that I felt like at that point something changed. Like before, I was scared, but I think I was still skeptical in the back of my head. I never seen anything. I only heard stories. But at this point, it was the first time I actually seen something. I don't know. That's the only way I can describe it, because the next thing that happened to me directly, and I remember in a certain way. And I never asked my mom how she remembers it, and I probably should have. But it's irrelevant. I probably would have just added it as a, oh yeah, by the way, this is what my mom said about the incident. So what I remember is my mom had these chests, like pirate chest looking things, and they were full of there were like these little like film, like camera film, and they were encased in glass and like taped around the edges, so it was like these glass little rectangles with film in the middle, and they were stacked in bunches and wrapped in newspaper, and there was like dozens and dozens and dozens of them in this trunk. And I remember this trunk being very heavy, like very, very heavy. It was on the floor in my mom's room. This particular night, my brothers and I were sleeping in my mom's bed, and my mom was in the shower when this occurred. My brothers were asleep. We had been playing with these little pieces of glass film, and we were looking at the pictures, and then some of them didn't get put away, and the newspaper was crumpled up on the floor, and there was a small pile of newspaper crumpled up on the floor at the base of the chest between the bed and the wall. Also between the bed and the wall was like a little nightstand, so it was probably a few feet gap between the bed and the wall, and this chest was at the foot of the bed all the way at the end, and there was newspaper on the floor, and I got my back to the wall, to the gap, and I'm facing my brothers, they're asleep, and I hear the newspaper rustling, and I stop, and I'm like catching my breath. I'm like trying to hold my breath to make out what I'm listening to, and then I'm positive it's the newspaper rustling, and I make the decision to pull the blanket up and over me so that it's got to be the blanket that's rustling the newspaper, basically, is my thought at that exact moment. So I pull the blanket up, and I still hear the newspaper rustling, and now I'm like scared, and I'm not sure what to do, and then all of a sudden I kind of get this moment of like, it's all in my head, I'm being dumb, let's just look at it, whatever it is, it can't hurt me, type of situation. And because I had my back to it, instead of like sitting up and looking, I leaned back like all the way over myself, so I was kind of twisted, and I see it's dark in the room. There's no lights on, but there's lights in the hall, and that light is projecting in. And I'm looking at the ground, at the trunk where the newspaper's at, and I couldn't at first make out what I was looking at. I could see that something was off, but it hadn't clicked yet. And then I realized that trunk is not on the ground. That trunk is like hovering off the ground. And now I'm like trying to am I seeing what I think I'm seeing? Is that what I think it is? And then that trunk slams against the wall. That's the last thing I remember. I don't know how I got outside. I don't know who was the first one to reach me. But the way I understood it was my mom was in the shower. She heard the thing slam against the wall. She heard the wall, big loud noise and everything just vibrate. And she shuts the shower off and she's yelling. She's like, hey, is everything okay? Hello? And then she probably hears the front door open. And then she gets out of the shower and she comes and checks on the boys, and they're probably awake, I'm assuming, from the noise, going, what's going on? My mom comes in, and then they realize I'm not there, and they start calling my name, and they're looking around, and then eventually they found me, and I was laying in the front yard. I don't remember how I got there. I don't remember anything after that. I do know that I don't think I went back in that house that night. I know that I was taken to my father's house, and I ended up sleeping on his couch in his little apartment in Wilmington. And I never went back to school. I didn't even finish that school year. And the next thing I know, we moved to Phoenix. I do remember going back to that house when it was time to leave, to move. I remember walking in that house very apprehensively. I remember it was like I want to say weeks had gone by, and we ended up, it was the day we left that house, Paramount, when everything was packed up and we're going to travel back to Phoenix. Like I said, years later, I got an opportunity to talk to Chris and ask him about that house. And from what I remember from the conversation, which was at this point was some time ago, he was saying that the house was eventually demolished, that they couldn't find people to occupy it long term, something like that, and that eventually they ended up, I don't know if his parents sold the house or they demolished it or how I don't remember what he said about that, other than that the house had been leveled and that it was demolished. So yeah, it's pretty crazy. I used to be real leery about telling that story because, but my brothers were there and my mom was there, and apparently Sky was conceived there, and so it is what it is. It's just a crazy thing that happened, and as a Christian, I believe that whatever that thing was evil. It was not some angry old man that got left behind, or was, I don't know. I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't believe in ghosts. Anyway, stay prayed up. Everybody have a great Easter. It's right around the corner. Hopefully I'll see you guys in church.